Welcome to the Haven Collective. I'm J.R. Foresteros, and this is the Beacon Bit. Today we're exploring the fascist tool of law and order rhetoric and bringing into conversation the infamous mark of the beast from Revelation chapter 13. In the news lately, President Trump has been making waves because he is deploying the National Guard to multiple U.S. cities under the guise of restoring law and order. Now, this is a phrase that he's been deploying since his first term. He deployed it particularly often during his campaign for the second term, even, posting it on his Truth Social, like literally just law and order with some exclamation points. So it's important to recognize that that particular phrase and the propaganda that it represents are a particular tool of fascist rhetoric that is designed specifically to divide citizens into us and them, and to consolidate the people that are considered lawful, or the us's, underneath the banner of the authoritarian movement. Now, this particular phrase, law and order, actually goes back to President Nixon and his infamous Southern strategy. After the Texas President Lyndon B. Johnson, who was a Democrat, signed the Civil Rights Acts in the 1960s, following another Democrat, John F. Kennedy, there was a mass exodus of Southerners from the Democratic Party who were incensed that the Democrats were supporting anti-segregation movements and civil rights. And so Nixon knew if he wanted to win the White House, he needed to come up with a way to court all of those disaffected formerly Democratic voters. And so this was what the Southern strategy was for. And they needed to figure out a way to appeal to the racism of white Southerners without explicitly being racist. Because again, in the wake of the civil rights movement, that had become a cultural taboo. And so Nixon's team came up with ways to mask racism in respectable clothing. And one of the best ways they found to do that was by talking about law and order, by suggesting that the cities that were predominantly African American were lawless hellholes that were full of criminals. And instead of using racial slurs directed at black people, they could deploy the term criminal, which again, Southern voters knew was coded to mean black Americans without actually having to say that. And when we do this, when we deploy the law and order rhetoric, when we divide people into the lawful and the orderly, and then the lawless and the chaotic, what we're actually doing is creating two classes of people, the citizen and the criminal. Here's what Jason Sandley says about this division. Fascist law and order rhetoric is explicitly meant to divide citizens into two classes: those of the chosen nation, who are lawful by nature, and those who are not, who are inherently lawless. To describe someone as criminal is both to mark that person with a terrifying, permanent character trait, and simultaneously to place that person outside the circle of us. They are criminals, while we make mistakes. Now, you might wonder if this is something that Nixon invented, but it's not. Remember, as we're talking about fascism throughout this series, we're not talking about some kind of new innovation that the Nazis invented during World War II, or that somehow Trump and the MAGA movement are pioneering. No, this is a perennial temptation that humanity faces, and we see it with all kinds of authoritarian movements throughout history, including in Rome, which brings us to the mark of the beast. Now, I know, when you think of the mark of the beast, you think of heavy metal bands and Satan worshiping, and maybe if you grew up in an evangelical church like me, like barcodes on your forehead or your hand or something like that. But it all comes from this particular passage in Revelation 13, where it talks about how the beast from the land, which remember is the kind of the false teacher of the church, the one that looks like a lamb but sounds like a dragon, encourages all of the people of the region to receive the sea beast's mark. And remember, the sea beast is Rome. It's the one that looks like the dragon and has the seven heads, which are the seven hills of the city and all of that. And then John gives us this really weird statement where he says the number of the beast is 666, or there's actually some readings that say 616. Either way, it works for this. Now, in order to understand what this means, you have to understand that ancient peoples loved to play with numbers. And since the Arabs had not invented the Arabic numerals that we use yet, 0 through 9, numbers were a lot harder. If you've ever tried to add in Roman numerals, you know that it can be a huge headache. And in the Hebrews actually didn't even have an independent numbering system. They used letters in the place of numbers whenever they needed to write numbers. So that let them play a lot with the kinds of numbers that they had. And so in this case, I'm going to skip a lot of the math, but you can see it in this graphic here, right? If you break down the letters of Nero Caesar, not in Greek, but in Hebrew, then those add up to the number 666. And there's an alternative spelling of it that is 616. Again, it works either way. But we've talked about Nero before, about how he was this sort of boogeyman for the Christians. He is the one that really ramped up the persecution of Christians when he blamed the fire of Rome on them. We talked about that in our conspiracy theories week. You probably remember that. But ultimately, what the mark of the beast does is it shows loyalty. That's why it's either on the hand to symbolize the things that we do, or on the head to symbolize the ways that we think. And very specifically, we're told that anyone who does not have the mark, anyone who doesn't demonstrate loyalty to Rome through what they do and how they think, is not permitted to engage in economic activity. They're not allowed to buy or sell, which is, again, one of the ways we know that the seven churches of Revelation was suffering when they were being faithful to Jesus instead of following the Roman cult of the emperor. Now, you might be thinking, this doesn't sound very much like Law and Order. This doesn't sound like criminal versus citizen or something like that. And you're right, but that's because in the Roman Empire, again, not Rome itself, but the entire empire, more than 90% of the population was not a citizen. Roman citizenship was a closely guarded privilege that was held to a very elite few, and so it wouldn't have made sense in the Roman province of Asia, modern-day Turkey, where the revelation is set, to talk in terms of citizen or non-citizen. If we're talking about loyalty to the empire, it made much more sense to talk about it in terms of economic loyalty, and again, in terms of hand and forehead, right? Thoughts and behaviors. And so the ultimate bottom line here is that the mark of the beast was an elegant way to divide people into us and them, in the same way that Law and Order rhetoric does. That is the entire function of the rhetoric, to identify who belongs, who is part of us, and who is a dangerous criminal. Right? If I speed, I'm breaking the law, and that might be a crime, but that doesn't make me a criminal because I'm a fundamentally good person. However, if that person is stealing and they're not part of us, then it doesn't matter why they're stealing, or maybe why they don't have documents and why they're here, right? They are a dangerous criminal, and because of that, we are justified in executing any kind of force we need to get rid of them. Again, Romans had the same fear. Here's Dr. Emma Southon from her incredible book, A Fatal Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, which is actually about murder in ancient Rome. She says this about Roman attitudes towards non-Romans. There was a sense among Roman citizens, one which was almost certainly false, that enslaved foreigners would eventually outnumber Romans and were an existential threat to Roman supremacy. Now, this was a fear that Roman authoritarians capitalized on for hundreds of years, even before the book of Revelation was written, as a way to justify their anti-foreigner policies. Much in the same way that the Trump administration today uses the threat of so-called dangerous illegals. Again, hear the categorizing there, right? They are illegals, they are non-citizens, they don't belong. To drum up support not only for his agendas, but for things like what ICE is doing around the country. It's truly a terrifying thing. And I think that what we must keep in mind is that the goal of this rhetoric is to separate us into us and them. It's so that we care about who has received the mark, who is part of us, who is legal, who is a good citizen, who is moral, and who is not. Because once we've divided ourselves into us and them, we can justify all sorts of wickedness against them in the name of preserving us. So what does that mean for those of us who are in the church? Well, we need to focus on how we can refuse these divisions that divide us from one another. We need to insist on the common humanity of everyone. And we need to figure out what it looks like to endorse that loudly and publicly in the face of this rhetoric that would seek to dehumanize us. I look forward to exploring what that's going to look like in our Beacon gatherings. Until then, grace and peace be with you.